They didn't kill Elenya Ashmere. They did something crueler. They erased her. Her name gone from the birth ledger. Her face gone from the guild rolls. Even the guards at the gate looked straight through her as if she were smoke standing in a doorway. 22 years of a life, undone in one afternoon, by a royal seal she never saw pressed. She had spent those 22 years scratching other people's names out of dusty ledgers, never once imagining her own name was the one someone had been erasing for 500 years. Again, and again, and again. Then 3 days after they threw her past the border stones and told her never to return, the sky over Eldoris turned the color of a bruise. A shadow wider than the royal palace rolled across the fields. Soldiers dropped their spears. Nobles fell to their knees in mud that would ruin silk they'd never wash again. And the last dragon king in the world, a creature kingdoms had bribed, begged, and bled to avoid, landed in front of a girl with no name, no home, and no idea that the sky itself had crossed an ocean to find her. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what Nora brings you next. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Chapter 1. The archive sanctuary of Eldoris smelled like dust that had given up trying to settle. Elenya Ashmere had lived inside that smell for as long as she could remember, which was not, she often thought, a very long time at all, because nobody in the capital seemed to remember her either. She was 22 years old, and she owned exactly 4 dresses, 2 ink-stained aprons, a chipped clay mug, and a small brass key that opened nothing anyone had ever explained to her. She had no parents that she could recall, no surname that meant anything at court, and no future beyond the one she'd built with her own 2 hands inside the oldest, dampest, most forgotten wing of the royal library. Her job, officially, was junior registrar of deprecated records. Unofficially, her job was erasing people. "You're doing it again," said Dissa Fenwick, shuffling between the shelves with a candle in one hand and a biscuit in the other, managing to drop crumbs on exactly 0 books despite 40 years of trying. Dissa was the only person in the sanctuary who spoke to Elenya as though she were a person and not a piece of furniture that occasionally fetched things. That face, the one where you're about to ask a question that's going to get us both in trouble. "I'm not asking anything," Elenya said, not looking up from the ledger in front of her. "You're thinking it very loudly. Is that a new skill, reading thoughts? Or have you finally admitted you're a witch like the kitchen staff say? 40 years in this room, and the worst thing anyone's ever caught me doing is falling asleep on a tax record from the reign of a king nobody remembers," Dissa said, easing herself into the chair across from Elenya, with the particular groan of a woman who blamed the weather for her knees, and the crown for everything else. "If I were a witch girl, I'd have hexed that door hinge into silence years ago. It's woken me from 3 good naps this month alone. Maybe the door's trying to tell you something." "The door," Dissa said, "is 200 years old and needs oil, same as me. Now, show me what's put that crease between your eyebrows before I go back to my nap, and you go back to pretending you don't have one." Elenya had learned, over 6 years, that there was no outrunning Dissa Fenwick's attention once it had been caught, so she stopped pretending to organize the shelf in front of her and reached for the ledger instead. Elenya smiled despite herself. 6 years working beside Dissa Fenwick had taught her that the old woman could read a held breath the way other people read a page. "Fine, look at this." She turned the ledger around. It was a birth and lineage record from nearly 200 years ago, its ink faded to the color of weak tea, its edges soft as cloth from centuries of careful handling. Near the bottom of the page, in the section reserved for minor noble houses, there was a name. Except there wasn't. Not anymore. Someone had taken a blade, not ink, not a scribe's careful crossout, but an actual blade, and scraped the surname off the vellum so thoroughly that the page was thin as a moth's wing in that one spot. You could hold it to the light and see clean through it. Somebody didn't like that family, Dissa said, unimpressed. Happens. Kings fall out of love with lesser houses all the time. Off with a name, off with a head, off with an inheritance. That's what I thought too. The first time. Elenya reached beneath the desk and pulled out a stack of ledgers she'd hidden there over the past 3 weeks, each one bookmarked with a strip of pale ribbon. But look, this one's from 140 years ago. Same technique. Same spot on the page, bottom of the minor nobility section, always a birth record, never a death record. This one's from 90 years ago. Same thing. This one's from 35 years ago. Dessa's biscuit stopped halfway to her mouth. Someone has been doing this, Elenya said quietly, every few decades for at least 200 years. Not a king losing his temper. A pattern. A policy. Pull the family name from context, Dessa said, setting the biscuit down entirely now, which was how Elenya knew she'd finally gotten her attention. Surrounding entries. Marriages, land grants, anything that references the missing name without erasing it. They worked until the candles burned to stubs. It took most of the night, cross-referencing marriage contracts and tax rolls and the marginal notes of long-dead clerks who'd had no idea they were leaving breadcrumbs for a girl not yet born. But eventually, in a property dispute record from over a century ago, they found it, a single line that someone had missed. The eastern orchard reverts to the crown upon the extinguishing of House Ashmere, there being no surviving. Elenya read the words 3 times before her mind would accept them. That's my name, she said. Ashmere is my name. Dessa didn't answer right away. When Elenya looked up, the old woman's face had gone the color of the ledger pages, pale, thin, something written on it that had been scraped almost to nothing. Dessa, that's my name. It's a common enough word, Dessa said too quickly. Ashmere, a lake of ash, could be anyone's name. Could be a coincidence. You don't believe that. I believe, Dessa said, standing so fast her chair scraped the stone floor like a scream, that it is very late and you are very tired. And tomorrow, this entire stack of ledgers goes back on the shelf, exactly where it came from, and we never speak of it again. It was the first time in 6 years Dessa Fenwick had ever lied to her badly enough that Elenya could see the shape of the truth underneath it. She didn't sleep that night. She told herself she was only going to check one more record, the newest one, the closest to her own lifetime, because if the pattern held, if some unseen hand really had been erasing House Ashmere every few decades like clockwork, then there should be one more entry. Recent. Maybe recent enough to have a face attached to the name instead of just ink. She found it in the birth registry from 22 years ago, filed in a locked cabinet she wasn't technically permitted to open, using the small brass key she'd carried her whole life and never known the purpose of. The entry hadn't been fully erased. Someone had started the work. She could see the first careful scrape of the blade along the top of the surname, and then stopped, as if they'd been interrupted. As if, for the first time in 200 years, someone had run out of time to finish the job. Last living heir Elenya Ashmere, born under the 7th moon, mother deceased, father unlisted, bloodline sealed by royal decree. The candle guttered. Somewhere above her, through layers of stone and centuries of dust, a bell in the palace tower began to toll for a reason she didn't yet understand, and wouldn't understand for 3 more days. Not until soldiers came for her in the gray hour before dawn. Not until a magistrate she'd never met read out a list of crimes she'd never committed. Not until the only life she'd ever known was declared, by royal seal, to have never existed at all. She sat alone in the archive sanctuary, holding the one document in the entire kingdom that proved she was real. And for the first time in 22 years, Elenya Ashmere understood that someone, somewhere, had been trying to erase her before she was even born, and had never quite finished the job. She should have run that night. She would spend the rest of her life wondering what would have changed if she had. Instead, she copied the entry, word for word, onto a scrap of paper she folded into her sleeve, and told herself that in the morning she would show it to someone who could explain it. Someone in authority. Someone who would look at 200 years of careful, deliberate erasure and be as horrified as she was. She had no way of knowing that the someone she chose would be the very person who'd give the order to erase her completely. By midday, 4 soldiers in the black and gold of the Royal Guard were standing in the archive sanctuary doorway, and the man walking between them wore the deep crimson robes of the Crown Inquisitor. A title Elenya had only ever seen written in the margins of records describing punishments too severe for ordinary courts. Elenya Ashmere, the Inquisitor said, and something about the careful, deliberate way he pronounced her surname told her he already knew far more about it than she did. You are charged with the forgery of royal lineage documents, with treasonous impersonation of an extinguished noble house, and with the theft of sealed crown property. I haven't forged anything, Elenya said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her almost as much as the soldiers now moving to flank her on either side. I found a record. I didn't create it. The record you claim to have found, the Inquisitor said, producing a folded document of his own, does not exist in the official registry as of this morning. He held it up. It was the birth ledger, the one with her name in it, the one she had touched with her own hands 12 hours ago. Except now, where her name had been, there was only a thin, translucent scrape of blank vellum, exactly like all the others. Someone had finished the job overnight. That's impossible, Elenya whispered. I saw it. Dissas saw it. The senior registrar, the Inquisitor said, has already given her statement. She states that no such entry exists, and never did. Elenya searched the doorway behind the soldiers for Dissas' face, for the old woman who'd fed her honey biscuits and taught her to read 3 dead languages and told her, more times than she could count, that she was the finest mind the sanctuary had seen in a generation. She found her standing in the corridor beyond the guards, pressed against the wall, eyes fixed on the floor. Dissas, Elenya said, tell them what we found. Dissas Fenwick did not lift her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, and her voice cracked directly down the middle of the lie. I've never seen that record in my life. It was, Elenya would understand much later, the kindest cruelty anyone ever showed her, because the alternative to Dissas' silence was Dissas' death, and the old woman had chosen the version where at least one of them survived the week. But in that moment, standing in the only home she had ever known, watching the one person who'd ever treated her like she mattered deny her existence to save her own neck, Elenya Ashmere felt something break inside her chest that would never fully mend. Not until a shadow the size of a cathedral finally taught her what it meant to be seen. The soldiers took her by both arms. The scrap of paper in her sleeve, the copied entry, the only proof left in the world that House Ashmere had ever existed, crackled against her skin like it was trying to warn her. The archive sanctuary doors groaned shut behind her. That same tired, uncomplaining hinge Dissas had always sworn was harmless. And Elenya thought, absurdly, that it sounded almost like an apology, as if even the building itself hadn't wanted to let her go without some small protest. Outside, the capital of Eldoris carried on exactly as it always had. Merchants called out the price of bread. Children chased a stray dog through the fountain square. A pair of washerwomen argued cheerfully over whose turn it was to haul water from the eastern well. None of them looked twice at the girl being marched between 4 soldiers, because none of them had any reason to. By royal decree, issued that very morning and already whispered through every guild hall in the city, Elenya Ashmere did not exist, and it is a strange, quiet horror to walk through a crowd of people who have all, somehow, already agreed to stop seeing you. She looked for faces she knew. She found Tomas Farrow, a boy she'd grown up beside in the orphan wing of the sanctuary annex, who had once split the last heel of bread with her during a lean winter and sworn they'd be friends until the mountains wore down to sand. He was standing outside the bakery with a satchel of correspondence under one arm, clearly on some errand for the guild he'd apprenticed into. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Then Tomas looked down at his satchel, adjusted the strap, and walked briskly in the opposite direction, the way a man walks when he has decided, quite deliberately, that he saw nothing at all. She had no idea, As they marched her out of the sanctuary and into a sky that had been perfectly, ordinarily blue that morning, that 400 miles to the west, across an ocean no ship had crossed in living memory, something ancient and enormous had just opened its eyes for the first time in 10 years, and turned its head, very slowly, toward Eldoris. Chapter 2. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less time than it took Elenya to walk to it. They held it in a side chamber of the Hall of Records, not the grand courtroom where nobles argued over land and titles, but a narrow, windowless room with a single high table and 3 magistrates who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Elenya understood why the moment the Crown Inquisitor began to speak. This was not a trial meant to discover the truth. It was a trial meant to file the truth away somewhere no one would ever look for it again. Elenya, self-styled Ashmere, the Inquisitor began, and the word self-styled landed like a slap. You stand accused of forging a royal lineage document, of impersonating a member of an extinguished noble house, and of theft of crown property, namely a sealed archive key issued under false pretense. I was given that key when I was 6 years old, Elenya said. By the sanctuary itself when I was placed there. I never stole anything. The sanctuary's intake records for that year, the Inquisitor said smoothly, show no child received under the name Ashmere. Then check under a different name. Check under any name. I know I was 6. I know I had a key. Someone gave it to me. We have checked, the Inquisitor said, and something in his tone made it clear that this particular lie had been prepared well in advance, polished like a blade before the fight even started. There is no record of your arrival at the sanctuary at all. As far as the Crown's registries are concerned, Elenya Ashmere is a name that has never belonged to a living person. One of the magistrates, an older man with tired eyes who had said nothing throughout the proceedings, finally looked up. Then who, he asked quietly, is standing in front of us? It was, Elenya would think later, the only honest question anyone asked that entire day. And it was never answered because the Inquisitor simply talked over it, the way water talks over a stone too small to redirect it. A forger, he said. A confidence woman who has spent 6 years positioning herself inside the royal archive, waiting for the opportunity to fabricate a claim to an extinguished house and its remaining assets. The Eastern Orchard alone is worth more than most nobles see in a decade. Elenya almost laughed, except laughing felt like the last thing her body had strength for. I didn't even know the name existed until last night. I found it by accident in a stack of ledgers I wasn't looking for. A convenient accident. You erased it, she said, and for the first time her voice rose, cracking across the narrow room like something breaking. I saw the entry. I saw my name in it. 12 hours later it was gone, scraped clean like all the others. And you're standing there telling me I forged something that someone else destroyed overnight to make sure I couldn't prove it existed. The room went very quiet. The Inquisitor's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a small, cold flicker, there and gone. The look of a man who has just realized his opponent understands more of the game than he expected. It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, it steadied her because it confirmed, beyond any doubt, that she wasn't imagining any of it. The sentence, he said, turning to address the magistrates instead of her, as if she had already stopped being a person worth speaking to directly, is banishment beyond the western border stones, effective immediately, with all citizenship, property, and legal existence formally revoked. The name Elenya Ashmere is to be struck from every remaining record in the kingdom, and the offender is to be known henceforth by no name at all. You can't erase a person, Elenya said. Her hands had begun to shake and she hated them for it. You can burn a page. You can't burn what's underneath it. The Inquisitor finally looked at her again, and for just a moment, something almost like curiosity crossed his face, as though her defiance were a small, interesting anomaly in an otherwise routine afternoon. You'd be surprised, he said, how much you can burn if you're patient enough and if you start early enough. 200 years is a very long time to practice. They marched her out through the servants' passage rather than the main hall, which she understood later was deliberate. No crowd to witness, no whispers to travel, no chance for anyone to ask questions the crown didn't want asked. The soldiers walked her through the western gate of the capital as the afternoon light turned amber, past the border stones that marked the edge of everything she had ever known, and left her there with nothing but the clothes on her back and the folded scrap of paper still hidden in her sleeve. The one piece of evidence they hadn't thought to search for, because as far as the official record was concerned, there had never been anything to find. "Don't come back," one of the soldiers said, not unkindly. He was young, younger than her, and something in his face suggested he didn't entirely believe the charges either, but belief had never been a requirement of the job. "Whatever's beyond those stones, it's kinder than what waits for you here if you're caught this side of them again." Then he turned and walked back through the gate, and it closed behind him with a sound like a door on a tomb. She remembered, standing there, the one memory she had of arriving at the sanctuary as a child. Not the trial, not the soldiers, but a smaller, older ache that had never fully healed. She had been 6, small enough that the sanctuary's front doors had looked like the gates of a mountain. A woman in a gray traveling cloak had knelt in front of her, pressed the brass key into her palm, closed her small fingers around it and said only, "Keep this. Someone will come for it one day. Until then, keep it safe and keep yourself safer." Elenya had asked her name. The woman had only smiled, sad and certain, and walked back into the fog before the question could be answered twice. She had told herself for 16 years that the woman was a nursemaid, a temple sister, someone paid to deliver an orphan and move on to the next one. She had never once let herself wonder whether the woman had known exactly what she was carrying, and exactly why it needed to be hidden. She understood now. It made the ache worse, not better, the way understanding often does. Halfway along the western road, as dusk thickened into full evening, she passed a merchant's cart pulled to the roadside, its driver crouched beside a wheel that had thrown its rim. He looked up as she approached, an older man, broad-shouldered with the particular weariness of someone who had been fixing the same stubborn cart for most of the afternoon. "You," he called, waving a wrench in her direction. "Girl, give me a hand with this axle, would you? 4 coppers if you can hold the frame steady while I—" He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes moved past her, to the empty road behind her, to the trees on either side, and something in his expression shifted from mild irritation to open confusion. "Sorry," he muttered, half to himself. "Thought I saw someone." "I'm right here," Elenya said. The merchant blinked at her, and for one strange, suspended moment, his gaze seemed to catch on her face, really catch, the way a hook catches cloth before sliding off again, unable to find purchase. "Right," he said slowly, in the tone of a man agreeing with something he didn't understand in order to avoid the discomfort of admitting it. "Right. Course you are." He turned back to his wheel without another word, and did not look at her again, even when she stepped close enough to touch the cart's frame, even when her shadow fell directly across his hands. It was, she thought, the strangest cruelty of everything the crown had done to her. She had expected exile. She had not expected to become genuinely difficult to see, as if the decree hadn't just stripped her name from paper but had reached into the world itself and loosened the thread that let people notice her at all. She left him to his wheel and kept walking, faster now, unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with the coming dark. Elenya stood alone on the western road as the sun began to set, and for a long time she didn't move at all. She thought about Dessa's face pressed against the corridor wall. She thought about Tomas adjusting the strap of his satchel and walking the other way. She thought about a name that had been erased and erased and erased again for 200 years, patient as rot, until it finally landed on her. She did not cry. She had expected to, and was almost disappointed in herself when the tears didn't come, as if even her grief had decided she wasn't worth the effort. Instead, she felt something colder and stranger settle into her chest, something that felt less like sorrow and more like the particular, focused stillness of a person deciding, very quietly, that she was not finished yet. She walked west because west was the only direction the road offered her, and because some small, stubborn part of her wanted to put as much distance as possible between herself and a kingdom that had worked this hard to convince the world she'd never been born. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours, the capital reduced to a smudge of torchlight behind her, when the temperature dropped. It happened all at once, the warm evening air replaced by something colder, sharper, carrying a mineral tang she didn't recognize, like the inside of a storm before the first crack of thunder. She looked up out of instinct, the way anyone does when the world suddenly feels wrong in a way they can't name, and saw that the sky to the west, over the sea no ship had crossed in living memory, had gone the deep bruised purple of a wound about to bleed. Lightning moved inside the clouds without striking down, threading between them like something alive, something searching. There was no thunder. That was the part that unsettled her most, the silence of it, as if the storm hadn't quite decided yet whether it wanted to announce itself. She told herself it was only weather. Strange weather, unseasonable weather, but weather all the same, and weather did not care about erased names or forged ledgers or a girl standing alone on a road with nothing left to her name but the name itself. She kept walking. The purple light kept spreading, slow and deliberate, swallowing one star at a time. By the time full dark fell, the entire western sky had turned the color of old bruises and older secrets, and somewhere far beneath that impossible light, something vast had begun, at last, to move. She didn't know its name yet. She would learn it soon enough, and she would spend the rest of her life understanding that the moment the sky changed color over her head was the exact moment the world's oldest, loneliest king finally caught the scent of the one thing he had crossed an ocean to find. She just kept walking, one foot after the other, a girl with no name under a sky that had just remembered hers. Behind her, miles back, the capital slept soundly, certain that the problem of Elenya Ashmere had been solved with a scrape of a blade and the stroke of a magistrate's pen. Ahead of her, the horizon kept bleeding that impossible bruised purple, wider now, closer now, and somewhere inside it. Something with wings the size of siege towers had finally, after 2 centuries of waiting, caught a scent it would not lose again. She had no way of knowing it yet, but the loneliest night of her life was also the last night she would ever spend unnoticed. The sky had already found her. It was only a matter of hours before the sky came down to say so. Chapter 3. 400 miles west of Eldoris, beyond a sea no ship had crossed in living memory, there was a place kingdoms had agreed, by unspoken and universal consent, never to sail toward. Sailors called it the Silent Coast, though there was nothing silent about it. The wind screamed through basalt spires taller than cathedrals, and the surf broke against black cliffs with a sound like the world clearing its throat. What the sailors meant, when they used the word silent, was that no one who went there ever came back to report what they'd seen. The coast had a way of keeping its secrets, mostly by keeping the people who found them. Aryan Velkar had lived there for 211 years. He did not think of it as living, exactly. He thought of it as waiting, though the distinction mattered only to him, since no one else had spoken to him directly in over a decade. Dragons his age did not require company the way younger creatures did. They required purpose, and purpose was the one thing Aryan had never lacked, even when everything else, court, kin, kingdom, had been stripped from him by the same slow, deliberate erasure that was, at that very moment, unfolding 400 miles to the east in a girl he had not yet met. He remembered the old world, before the human kings learned to lie about dragons instead of fearing them honestly. He remembered when his kind did not obey thrones, did not carry crowned riders into battle for gold and territory, did not answer to anyone at all except the rare, remarkable humans born with a resonance in their blood that dragons could feel from 100 miles away. A frequency, a note, a call that no dragon alive had ever been able to fully explain, only recognize, the way you recognize your own name spoken in a crowded room. Keepers, the old tongues called them. Not masters, not riders. Keepers because they did not command dragons, they remembered them, held some ancient thread of connection that predated every crown and every war, and dragons, in turn, remembered them back. It had been the greatest fear of every human king in history, because a throne built on the claim of dragon favor meant nothing the moment a real keeper walked into a room. So the kings had done what frightened, clever men have always done to things they cannot control. They erased it. House by house, record by record, century by century, the old bloodlines had been hunted, scattered, and finally scraped from history so thoroughly that most humans alive today believed keepers were a folk tale invented to frighten children away from wandering too near the coastline. Arion knew better, because he was the last dragon alive old enough to remember the truth, and because for 211 years he had felt the resonance flicker in and out of the world like a candle behind fogged glass. Present, then gone, present, then gone. A bloodline the kings kept finding and finding and finding again despite their best efforts to extinguish it. He had almost given up hope of ever meeting one. Almost. 3 days ago, the flicker had returned, fainter than usual, tangled somewhere inside the walls of a kingdom he despised more than any other for the particular thoroughness of its lies, but unmistakably, undeniably there. And then, 12 hours ago, it had done something it had never done before in 2 centuries of watching. It had grown stronger. Something had happened to the keeper. Something that had cracked whatever seal had been keeping the resonance dim. And Arion, alone on his black cliffs with nothing but 2 centuries of patience, and an anger old enough to have fossilized into something calmer and far more dangerous, had felt it the way a man feels his own pulse quicken. He did not deliberate long. Deliberation was a luxury for creatures with more time left than certainty about how to spend it, and Arion had neither. He crossed the sea no ship had crossed in a single night, wings cutting through storm systems that scattered fishing fleets 300 miles off course, and did not slow until the coastline of Eldoris rose beneath him, torchlit and small, and utterly unaware of what was descending on it. He found her on the western road at the exact hour lesser men call the darkest part of the night, though Arion had never much cared for that phrase. In his experience, the darkest part of any story was rarely the part that happened at night. She was smaller than he expected. That surprised him somehow, after 200 years of imagining what a keeper might look like. He had pictured someone forged in fire, someone who carried the weight of an erased bloodline the way a soldier carries a sword. Instead, he found a girl in a plain traveling dress, hair the color of moonlight on water, standing perfectly still in the middle of an empty road, looking up at him with an expression that was not fear, exactly, though it had fear somewhere inside it. It was closer to recognition, as if some deep, wordless part of her had been expecting him for longer than she'd been alive. He landed close enough that the impact cracked the road stones beneath him, close enough that soldiers 3 miles distant felt the tremor through their boots and abandoned their posts without a second thought. He did not roar. He did not threaten. He simply folded his wings, lowered his head until his enormous, molten eyes were nearly level with hers, and studied her the way a man studies a door he has spent 2 centuries searching for the key to. "Why," Arion Velkar said, in a voice that shook loose stones from the cliffs a mile behind him, "does the world speak as though you are forgotten?" For a long moment, Elenya could not make her voice work at all. She had spent the last 3 days being erased by increasingly official means. A ledger, a magistrate, a friend's turned back, and none of it had prepared her for the particular, overwhelming reality of a dragon large enough to blot out the moon, addressing her directly, as though her answer mattered more than anything else in the world. "Because nobody remembers me," she said finally, and hated how small her voice sounded against the vast, patient silence he offered her in return. Something shifted behind those molten eyes, not quite a smile. Dragons did not have the face for smiling, but something adjacent to it, an old and weary satisfaction. The look of a man finally setting down a burden he had carried so long he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. "Then the world remembers incorrectly," Arion said, "and it will be corrected." Elenya took a step back despite herself, one hand rising instinctively as if she could hold off a creature the size of a hill with nothing but her palm. I don't understand any of this. 3 days ago I erased names from old books for a living. Now there's a dragon standing in the middle of the road, talking to me like I'm supposed to know what any of this means. You are not supposed to know, Arian said. You are supposed to remember. There is a difference, though it may take some time before you understand it. Remember what? Everything they took from you, he said, and everything they were too afraid to let you keep. Behind her, distant but closing fast, she could hear the sound of horses, soldiers from the nearest garrison, roused by the tremor of his landing, riding hard toward the western road with torches and spears, and, she suspected, very little idea of what they were riding toward. Arian's great head turned toward the sound, unbothered, the way a mountain is unbothered by weather. They're coming for you, Elenya said. You should go. Whatever I am, whatever this is, it isn't worth. They are not coming for me, Arian said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet, very cold, in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. No creature born of this kingdom has come for me in 200 years, and lived to speak of it. They are coming for you, girl who erases names, because they have only just realized what I already know. What's that? That the sky remembers what your kingdom tried to forget, Arian said, unfurling his wings so wide they blotted out half the visible stars, casting the entire western road into a shadow deeper than the night around it, and the sky is done being patient about it. The horses were close now, close enough that she could hear the officers shouting formation orders, close enough that torchlight flickered against the underside of Arian's wings like something out of an old, half-forgotten story about a girl and a dragon, and a kingdom built on lies too old to remember telling. Elenya Ashmere, Arian said, and it was the first time anyone besides Dissa had spoken her full name gently in 3 days. I did not cross an ocean to watch them take you a second time. The garrison riders crested the low hill behind them at a full gallop, torches streaming, and skidded to a stop so sudden and so total that 2 of the horses reared and unseated their riders directly into the roadside ditch. The officer in charge, a stout man with a mustache waxed into 2 aggressive points, clearly unused to situations his training manual had never covered, dismounted with considerably more caution than his approach had suggested, sword drawn but held at an angle that made it very clear he had no intention of getting close enough to use it. By order of the crown, he called out in a voice that cracked slightly on the word crown. You will, he stopped, looked up, kept looking up past Arian's foreleg, past the vast wall of his chest, all the way to the crowned head silhouetted against what remained of the stars. His sword arm lowered several inches without any apparent input from the rest of him. You will, he tried again, considerably softer, surrender the fugitive. Which fugitive, Arian said, would that be? The officer blinked. Beside him, one of his soldiers, younger, clearly newer to the garrison, and possibly the only one present still capable of independent thought, leaned over and murmured something that sounded suspiciously like maybe we let this one go, sir. The girl, the officer said, recovering some of his composure. The forger, Elenya no name by royal decree, she has no legal. She has a name, Arian said, and the ground trembled faintly beneath the weight of the words alone, no roar required. I have just spoken it. If your king's decree cannot survive one dragon saying it aloud, perhaps the decree was never as strong as he believed. The officer opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Whatever training he'd received for confronting armed rebels, foreign spies, or even the occasional rogue noble had, quite understandably, never included a chapter on what to do when the largest living creature in the known world offered a calm, devastating rebuttal to royal legal doctrine. He looked at his men. His men looked back at him with the specific, pleading expression of soldiers who would very much like their commanding officer to make a decision that did not involve any of them dying tonight. Will, the officer said, sheathing his sword with the trembling dignity of a man choosing his battles very, very carefully, report this to the capital, immediately. Do, Arian said. Tell them the sky remembers what they tried to forget. Tell them it is coming to collect what is owed. The garrison retreated with a speed that would have been comic under any other circumstances, torches bobbing wildly as they wheeled their horses back the way they'd come. The young soldier who'd whispered maybe, "We let this one go," now visibly congratulating himself on his foresight. Elenya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and found, to her own surprise, that some small and unfamiliar corner of herself wanted to laugh. Not from joy, from something closer to disbelief. The particular hysteria of watching the machinery that had just destroyed your entire life turn and flee from something even it couldn't erase. "They'll come back," she said, "with more soldiers, with the Inquisitor, maybe with the king himself." "They will," Arian agreed. "And they will find nothing here but road stones and a very confused merchant's cart. Because by the time they return, you and I will be 400 miles from anywhere their maps have names for." He lowered one enormous foreleg to the ground beside her, an unmistakable, deliberate invitation, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Elenya Ashmere had to decide whether to run from the last thing in the world that had ever looked at her and seen someone worth remembering. Chapter 4. She said yes without ever quite deciding to. That was how Elenya would describe it later, when she had the words for it. Not a choice so much as a recognition. The way you recognize a room you've never physically stood in but somehow already know the shape of. One moment she was staring at an enormous clawed foreleg lowered into the dust of the western road, and the next she was climbing it as though her body had made the decision 3 days ago, and was only now informing the rest of her. Flying, she would learn, was nothing like the stories described. It was not graceful. It was not gentle. The first surge of Arian's wings nearly threw her from her perch at the base of his neck, and she spent the first several minutes with both fists locked into the ridged scales along his spine, eyes shut, stomach somewhere several hundred feet below where the rest of her had ended up, but somewhere over the coastline, as the lights of Eldoris shrank to embers, and then to nothing at all. The terror gave way to something else, something enormous and quiet and entirely new. The particular vertigo of a girl who had spent her whole life being told she was too small to matter, discovering that the whole visible world had become small beneath her instead. "You may open your eyes," Arian said, his voice carrying easily over the wind despite never rising. "There is very little left to fear up here. Falling requires my cooperation, and I have waited 200 years for you. I am not inclined to drop you 3 hours into the arrangement. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. It was not meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be accurate. Despite everything, the exile, the trial, the sword-drawn soldiers who'd fled into the dark, Elenya felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward, and hated how much she needed that small, involuntary proof that she could still feel something other than grief. She opened her eyes. The sea spread beneath them, black and vast and threaded with moonlight, and ahead of them, rising out of the water like the spine of some ancient, sleeping creature, stood a chain of cliffs unlike anything she had ever seen or heard described. Basalt spires climbed hundreds of feet into a sky still bruised with the strange purple light she'd watched spread over the horizon the night before, and nestled among those spires, carved so seamlessly into the stone that she wouldn't have noticed it at all if Arian hadn't begun his descent directly toward it, was a structure, not a castle, not a fortress, something older than either word, built in a style she had never encountered in any of the thousands of records she'd catalogued. Arches that curved like folded wings, windows shaped like open eyes, staircases that seemed to spiral toward the sky rather than away from it. "What is this place?" she asked, as Arian banked low over a courtyard wide enough to hold a small city. "This," he said, "is the last sky sanctuary. There were 7 once scattered across the old world, each one built by keepers and dragons together, in the centuries before your ancestors decided the arrangement was too dangerous to allow. 6 were destroyed. Burned mostly, though your kingdom's records will tell you they collapsed from age or storm or divine punishment for some invented sin. This is the 7th, the only one that survived, because it was hidden well enough, and because I never stopped guarding it. He landed in the wide central courtyard with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature his size, folding his wings with a sound like sails coming down, and lowered his foreleg once more so Elenya could climb down onto solid ground that did not sway or drop beneath her. Her legs did not want to hold her weight. She stood anyway, out of stubbornness more than strength, and looked around at a courtyard paved in stone so old it had been worn smooth in patterns. Not randomly, she realized, crouching to look closer, but deliberately in the shape of wings, dozens of them, radiating outward from a central point like the wings of 100 different dragons had all touched down in that exact same spot across centuries. They came here, she said slowly. Again and again, this wasn't one visit, this was a tradition, a ritual. A homecoming, Arian said. Every keeper who ever lived stood where you are standing now at least once in their lifetime. It is, I imagine, the reason the resonance always feels strongest here. Not magic precisely, though your kind has never had a better word for it. Memory. The stone remembers, the way I remember, the way you are about to. He let her walk slowly enough that she could keep pace on foot, which she understood, even in her exhaustion, was its own small and deliberate kindness. Through an archway carved with symbols she didn't recognize, into a long gallery whose walls, ceiling, and even floor were covered in murals so vast and so detailed that she had to stop walking entirely, just to take them in. Dragons, hundreds of them, rendered in pigments that had somehow survived centuries without fading, sweeping across the walls in formations that told a story if you knew how to read them the way Elenya had spent her whole life learning to read old records. Battles, coronations, a great burning that stretched across an entire wall, cities in flame beneath a sky full of fleeing wings, and faces, human faces, painted small among the dragons, recurring again and again across different sections of the mural, different centuries by the style of the brushwork, different clothing, different eras, but the same face over and over, close-set eyes and a stubborn set to the jaw, hair the color of moonlight on water. Her face. Elenya stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by 200 years. No, she understood now, looking closer at the oldest sections. Easily 1,000 years of her own features painted onto the walls of a place she had never once heard of, by artists who had died so long ago their names existed nowhere in any record she had ever catalogued, and felt the last, stubborn wall she'd built around herself over 3 days of disaster finally begin to crack. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "It is the only thing in this gallery that has ever been entirely possible," Arian said, settling his enormous frame along the far wall so that his head came level with hers, patient as stone. "You are not the first keeper your kingdom tried to erase, Elenya Ashmere. You are only the first one who lived long enough and found enough of the truth in time to reach me before they finished the work." She reached out, hesitant, and pressed her palm against the nearest painted face, her own face, rendered by a hand dead for centuries, staring back at her with an expression she recognized immediately, because she had worn it herself 3 days ago, standing in a narrow trial chamber, refusing to believe that the ground beneath her had already been erased. It was the exact expression of a woman who had not yet learned she was about to lose everything. Somewhere behind her, deeper in the sanctuary, she heard footsteps, light, quick, unmistakably human, moving toward the gallery with the particular urgency of someone who had heard a dragon's wings return and had been waiting, possibly for a very long time, to see who he'd finally brought home. "Arian," a voice called, echoing off the ancient stone, equal parts hopeful and disbelieving. "Tell me that's not just you talking to yourself again. Tell me you actually found her." Elenya turned from the mural, heart still hammering from everything she'd just seen, to find a young man jogging into the gallery with the breathless, disheveled energy of someone who had clearly been asleep 10 minutes ago, and had thrown on his boots without checking whether they matched. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with the wiry build of someone who spent more time climbing things than walking around them, and a scar along one eyebrow that gave his whole face a permanently skeptical expression. Even now, even mid-sprint. He stopped dead the moment he saw her, skidded slightly on the smooth stone floor and stared. "Oh," he said. "Oh, you actually did it. 200 years and you actually—" He turned to Arian, pointing an accusing finger the size of the dragon made almost comically small. "You couldn't have sent a message ahead, a signal, anything. I've been asleep in my boots for a month in case tonight was the night, and tonight was the night, and I still had to run here in my nightshirt like an idiot." "You are not wearing a nightshirt," Arian observed. "I am wearing the nightshirt I fell asleep in 3 shirts ago, which is functionally the same thing." He turned back to Elenya, and something in his expression softened considerably, the sarcasm falling away all at once. "Sorry, Rin Castor. I keep this place running when His Majesty here is off being dramatic on a cliff somewhere for a decade at a time. He stopped himself, visibly choosing his next words with more care than the rest of the conversation had suggested he was capable of. "You're the one, aren't you, the resonance? We've felt it flicker for years, never this strong." "Elenya," she said, still faintly dazed, gesturing weakly at the walls around her. "Ashmere apparently, though I only learned that 4 days ago, along with the part where I got exiled for knowing it." Rin winced with real sympathy. "Yeah, that tracks. That's how it usually goes. Kingdoms don't exactly send a nice letter and a fruit basket when they find a keeper, they panic, and panicking kings do panicking king things. Ledgers mostly, occasionally worse." He glanced at Arian, some silent, well-worn exchange passing between them. "How bad was it this time?" "Banishment," Arian said. "Erasure of citizenship, of name, of the very record of her birth. They very nearly finished the work before I arrived." "Nearly," Rin repeated, looking back at Elenya with new weight in his expression. "But not quite. That's rarer than you'd think. Most of them get finished." He seemed to catch himself, wincing again. "Sorry, not exactly comforting bedside conversation, is it? I've been living with a 200-year-old dragon for 11 years. My sense of what counts as small talk has gotten a bit warped." Despite everything, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her, despite a night that had upended every fact she'd ever believed about her own life, Elenya felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the easy, unbothered warmth in his voice. The first ordinary human conversation she'd had since the trial, delivered by a man in mismatched boots who apparently found dragons less remarkable than most people found the weather. "How did you end up here?" she asked. "Keeping a sky sanctuary running for a dragon king seems like an unusual career." "Family tradition, believe it or not," Rin said, dropping onto a low stone bench along the gallery wall as though the conversation had earned him the right to finally sit down. "My grandmother served the last keeper anyone can properly document 3 generations back. Before that, Bloodline went quiet too. When she died, the duty passed to my mother, and when my mother decided she'd rather run a vineyard in peace, it passed to me, mostly because I was the only one who didn't run screaming the first time Arian landed in the courtyard to introduce himself." "I did not attempt to be frightening," Arian said, with the particular dignity of someone who had clearly had this argument many times before. "You are 11 tons and you introduced yourself by blocking out the sun," Rin said. "Frightening was the default setting, Your Majesty. No attempt required." He looked back at Elenya, grinning now, some of the sleepless urgency finally draining out of his posture. "Anyway, welcome to the last sky sanctuary in the world. Sorry about the state of the guest quarters. We weren't exactly expecting company on this particular decade's schedule." It was, Elenya thought, the strangest, gentlest laugh she'd allowed herself since the trial, not because anything about her situation had actually gotten lighter, but because, for the first time in 4 days, someone was speaking to her as though her survival were not remarkable, only expected, only overdue. She turned from the mural, heart still hammering from everything she'd just seen, and let herself, for one small and fragile moment, believe that she had finally found a place where the world had already agreed not to forget her. Chapter 5. She woke the next morning in a room carved directly into the cliffside, sunlight pouring through a window shaped like an open eye, and for 3 full seconds she forgot everything that had happened and simply lay still, listening to the sound of waves breaking somewhere far below, feeling more rested than she had in longer than she could remember. Then she remembered, all at once, the way grief and wonder tend to arrive together when there hasn't been time to sort them properly, and she lay there a moment longer, letting both feelings settle into something she could carry without dropping. Rin found her in the gallery an hour later, standing once again in front of the mural of her own repeated face, and didn't comment on how long she must have been there. He simply handed her a cup of something warm and bitter that tasted like burnt honey and told her, with the breezy confidence of a man who had clearly given this particular tour before, that today they were going to teach her what her blood already knew and her mind hadn't caught up to yet. The resonance isn't something you learn, he explained, leading her down a spiral staircase toward the lower levels of the sanctuary, where the walls gave way to open galleries overlooking the sea. It's something you remember. That's the whole trick of it and also the whole frustration of it, because you can't force a memory. You can only get out of its way. That's not remotely helpful. No, Rin agreed cheerfully. It wasn't helpful for me either, and I've had 11 years to get used to explaining it badly. They found Arian waiting on a wide stone terrace that jutted out over the cliff face like the prow of some enormous ship, wings folded, watching the sea with the particular stillness of a creature who measured time in centuries rather than mornings. He turned his head as they approached, and something in his molten eyes seemed to warm slightly at the sight of her, a small thing, easy to miss. But Elenya had spent 6 years learning to read the smallest details in old documents, and she was not so far removed from that training that she missed it now. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I expected to, given that I fell asleep in a Dragon King's sanctuary the same day I got exiled from my own kingdom. A reasonable achievement under the circumstances." He lowered himself, folding his great body until his head rested nearly level with the terrace floor. "Sit. There is a great deal to explain, and very little time in which to explain it, because I do not believe your kingdom will remain confused about what happened on that road for very long." She sat, cross-legged on sun-warmed stone, and for the better part of the morning, Arian told her everything he had spent 200 years waiting to tell someone. He told her about the old world, before the crowns learned to lie. A world where dragons and keepers moved together not as master and servant, nor even quite as equals, but as something closer to old friends who happened to speak different languages and had simply decided, generations ago, that the difficulty of translation was worth the reward of understanding. He told her about the resonance itself, an inherited thread of connection passed down through certain bloodlines, not chosen, not earned, simply born. A frequency dragons could feel from 100 miles away, undimmed by distance, undimmed even by centuries of silence, because the resonance did not fade. It only waited. He told her about the first king of Eldoris who had understood the danger clearly enough to act on it, a man named in the murals only by a single, deliberately unflattering symbol, who had realized that a throne-claiming divine dragon favor could not survive the presence of someone dragons actually chose to follow. And he told her, in a voice that had gone very quiet, about what that king had done about it, and what every king after him had continued doing, patiently, methodically, for 200 years, until the bloodline had been reduced to nothing but a girl in an archive who erased other people's names for a living, never once suspecting she was reading her own family's obituary, written in installments, 1 century at a time. "Why didn't you find one of us sooner?" she asked when he'd finished. "If the resonance never fades, if you've been waiting 200 years, why not the moment it appeared instead of waiting until the very end when they'd almost finished the work?" Arian was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Because the resonance flickers," he said finally, "when its bearer does not yet know what they carry. It grows strong only when the bearer begins, however faintly, to remember, to ask the questions their blood has been asking for centuries. Your predecessors, most of them, never had the chance. They were found and erased before they ever opened a single ledger, before they ever scratched at the surface of what they were. You are the first in 5 generations who found the thread herself, before anyone came to cut it. That doesn't sound like luck, Elenya said slowly. That sounds like something you're not telling me. Beside her, Rin made a small, strangled sound that was very clearly an attempt to disguise a laugh as a cough, and Arian shot him a look that would have withered a lesser man on the spot. She's sharper than the last several, Rin said, entirely unrepentant. You should probably just tell her. Arian exhaled, a long, low rumble that stirred loose dust along the terrace floor. The brass key, he said. The one you carried your whole life and never understood the purpose of. It was not simply a key, Elenya. It was a resonance anchor, an object crafted by the last generation of keepers who understood they were running out of time, designed to hold a fragment of the bloodline's connection safely, quietly, in a form too small and too ordinary for any inquisitor to think twice about. Whoever gave it to you at 6 years old knew exactly what she was protecting, and knew exactly what it would cost her if she was ever caught doing it. Elenya's hand went, without thinking, to the small weight still hanging from a cord beneath her collar, the key she had carried through 6 years of archive work, through a trial, through exile, through a night spent riding a dragon's back across an ocean, never once suspecting it was anything more than an unanswered question from her childhood. The woman in the gray cloak, she whispered. She said someone would come for it one day. She was right, Arian said. It only took 200 years, and I am sorry, more sorry than I have words for, in any tongue I have learned in 2 centuries, that it took this long, and cost you this much. Before the silence could settle too deeply, Rin clapped his hands together with the enthusiasm of a man eager to change the subject before it turned into something he'd have to feel too much about before breakfast. Right, enough ancient tragedy for one morning. Let's see if any of it actually works. See if what actually works, Elenya asked warily. The resonance. You've been carrying an anchor for 16 years and standing next to the last dragon in the world for less than a day. Theoretically, that should be enough to feel something if the old texts are right. He nodded toward Arian. Go on, try to call him. Not out loud necessarily, just reach. Reach with what? I don't have claws, I don't have wings. I don't even know what I'm supposed to be reaching toward. That, Arian said, is precisely the problem every keeper has faced on their first attempt. You are looking for an instrument you do not possess, when the instrument you actually have is considerably older and considerably simpler. He lowered his head until his eye, vast and molten and patient, filled most of her vision. Close your eyes. Do not think of me as a dragon. Think of me as a sound you heard once, in a room you can no longer remember and have been trying to place ever since. Elenya closed her eyes, feeling faintly ridiculous, acutely aware of Rin watching with the barely contained anticipation of a man who had clearly seen this go both very well and very badly on prior occasions. She reached for the memory of the mural, the dozens of painted faces that shared her jaw and her eyes, the sense, however impossible, that she had stood on this terrace before, in some form, in some century she couldn't name. Something answered. It was not a sound, not quite, and not a feeling either, closer to the particular, wordless certainty of recognizing a person's footsteps on a staircase before they've come into view. A warmth spread from the brass key against her collarbone, faint but unmistakable, threading up through her chest like the first note of a song she'd forgotten she knew all the words to. Her eyes flew open. Arian had gone very still, wings half raised. An expression on his ancient face that she would later understand was something very close to wonder. You felt that, she said, half question, half accusation. I felt that, he confirmed, from the base of my spine to the tip of every wing. It has been 200 years since anything called to me that way, Elenya Ashmere. I had begun to fear I would die on these cliffs before I ever felt it again. I told you she'd have it faster than most, Rin said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier breeziness, gone quiet and reverent in a way that suited him less naturally than the sarcasm had. Grandmother always said the anchor works best for the ones who never knew they were waiting. Elenya looked down at the small brass key, warm now against her skin in a way it had never been in 16 years of carrying it, and felt, for the first time since the trial had stripped her of everything she thought she owned, something that was unmistakably, undeniably her own. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The sea moved beneath the terrace in slow, patient rhythms, and somewhere far above, a single seabird cut across the bruised remains of the previous night's strange light, now fading back into ordinary blue. "I'm not sorry," Elenya said finally, surprising herself with how steady the words came out. "I spent 22 years being nobody. 3 days ago I found out I was somebody's careful, deliberate secret, and I still don't fully understand what that means. But nobody has ever looked at me the way you looked at me on that road. Like finding me mattered more than anything else you could have been doing with 200 years. She looked up, meeting his molten gaze directly for the first time since they'd landed. "I'd rather be somebody's secret worth protecting than nobody's daughter at all." Something shifted in Arian's expression, not quite the almost smile from the night before, but something deeper, older, the particular stillness of a creature who had waited 2 centuries for a sentence he hadn't known he needed to hear. "Then let us make certain," he said, "that no one ever tries to erase you again." Behind them, Rin cleared his throat with theatrical loudness. "As touching as this is, and it is genuinely touching, I hate to interrupt, but I think we have a problem." He was looking east, toward the horizon, where a thin, dark line had appeared against the morning sky, growing larger and more defined with every passing second. Not a storm, not a flock of birds. Ships. A great many ships, sails marked with the black and gold of Eldoris, cutting through waters no fleet had dared cross in living memory, moving with grim and deliberate purpose directly toward the cliffs of the last sky sanctuary in the world. "They found us," Elenya breathed. "No," Arian said, rising to his full height, wings unfurling with a sound like the sky itself tearing open. "They found the coastline. They have not yet found what they will lose by coming here." Chapter 6. The ships of Eldoris did not sail so much as they crept, the way anything creeps when it is more afraid of what it's approaching than it wants to admit. Elenya watched them from the terrace as they drew closer, counting the sails out of old archival habit. 12 vessels, more than any single garrison could muster on short notice, which told her, more clearly than any dispatch could have, exactly how seriously the capital had taken the reports of a dragon walking a girl off the western road. This was not a rescue party sent to retrieve a fugitive. This was a war fleet, dressed up in the polite language of an official inquiry. "They brought the Inquisitor," Rin said, squinting through a brass spyglass he'd produced from somewhere inside his mismatched nightshirt. "Crimson robes, front deck of the lead ship, looking extremely pleased with himself for a man about to have a very bad morning." "They also brought Lord Cray," Arian said, without benefit of a spyglass, his eyesight apparently rendering the instrument redundant. "The king's chief advisor. He does not leave the capital for minor matters." Elenya's stomach turned. She had never met Lord Petran Cray in person, but his name appeared in the margins of half the archive's most sensitive records, the man responsible, according to whispered rumor among the sanctuary clerks, for deciding which inconvenient truths were filed away and which were simply burned. "If Cray came himself," she said slowly, "then this was never about a forgery charge. He's here because someone above the Inquisitor wanted to see for themselves whether the old stories were true." "The king," Arian said. "It would not surprise me if Dorian Malrose is aboard that fleet himself, hidden below decks where his advisors could pretend he wasn't foolish enough to sail into a dragon's territory. Kings rarely trust important matters to reports alone, not when the truth might finally catch up to 200 years of careful lying." The fleet anchored at a cautious distance from the cliffs, close enough to signal intent, far enough, Elenya suspected, that someone aboard had done the mathematics of dragon wingspan and decided discretion was the better part of an already reckless voyage. A single smaller boat detached from the lead ship and rowed toward a narrow strip of black sand at the base of the cliffs, carrying, she counted, 6 figures. The Inquisitor in his crimson robes, Lord Cray in traveling gray, and 4 soldiers who looked considerably less enthusiastic about their assignment than either man leading them. "They want to talk," Rin observed. "They want to measure," Arian corrected. "There is a difference. Talking implies they are prepared to hear something that might change their plans. Measuring only requires them to stand close enough to plan their next move." He descended to the narrow beach himself, rather than wait for them to climb, landing with enough controlled force to send a spray of black sand into the air, close enough to the small boat that 2 of the soldiers immediately abandoned their oars and pressed themselves flat against the hull. Elenya climbed down after him, refusing Rin's offer of a slower path along the cliff stairs, some new and unfamiliar stubbornness insisting that she meet this confrontation on her own feet rather than be carried into it. Lord Cray recovered his composure faster than the soldiers had, stepping out of the boat with the careful, unhurried dignity of a man who had spent a lifetime learning never to let his face show what his mind was calculating. He was older than Elenya expected, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been considered kind in its youth, and had simply hardened slowly into something colder with each year spent close to a throne. "Elenya Ashmere," he said, and unlike the Inquisitor's careful, poisonous pronunciation of the name during the trial, Cray said it plainly, almost gently, as though testing how it felt in his mouth after 200 years of his office avoiding it. "You've caused quite a disturbance." "I found a name in a ledger," she said. "You caused the disturbance when you decided that was a crime worth erasing me over." Something flickered behind Cray's eyes, not quite guilt, she thought, but something adjacent to it, the particular discomfort of a man confronted with the actual, breathing consequence of a policy he'd only ever handled on paper. "I did not write the decree that erased your bloodline, girl. I inherited an office and a set of instructions 2 centuries old, and I have spent 30 years enforcing them because the alternative, a keeper walking free, a dragon answering to someone other than the crown, has always been considered, by every advisor before me, an existential threat to the kingdom's stability. So it's easier to erase a person than to explain to your king that his throne was never built on dragon favor at all," Elenya said. "Easier to burn 200 years of names than admit the whole foundation was a lie." "Careful," the Inquisitor said, stepping forward with a hand resting meaningfully on the hilt of his sword, though even he seemed to understand, standing this close to Arian's folded but very much present wings, how little that gesture actually accomplished. "You remain, by royal decree, a fugitive." "She remains," Arian said, and the words rolled across the beach with enough weight that the soldiers in the boat flinched as one. "Under my protection, which, as your Inquisitor should know from his own histories, has outranked royal decree since long before your kingdom existed to write one. You may return to your king and inform him that the erasure has failed. The bloodline lives, the sanctuary stands, and I am done watching from the cliffs while his ancestors' lies continue costing his subjects their names." Lord Cray studied Arian for a long moment, and Elenya watched something calculating pass behind his eyes. Not fear, exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but the particular, patient look of a man already rehearsing how he would explain this failure to a king who would not want to hear it. "The kingdom will not simply accept a keeper returning to challenge 200 years of settled succession," he said finally. "Whatever you believe your claim entitles you to, Elenya Ashmere, there are nobles, generals, and clergy in that capital who have built entire lives on the story your existence now threatens to unravel. They will not surrender that story quietly." "I haven't asked anyone to surrender anything," Elenya said. "I only want the truth back on the page. If that terrifies people who built their whole lives on a lie, that isn't my failure to fix." "It rarely is," Cray said, and for just a moment something almost like respect crossed his weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I would advise you both to consider your next move carefully. The king does not respond well to public humiliation, and a war fleet retreating from a single dragon and an archive clerk is precisely that, however satisfying it may feel today. He will not come back with 12 ships next time. He turned without waiting for a response, gathering the inquisitor and the reluctant soldiers back toward their boat with the brisk efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that the worst news should always be delivered and departed from as quickly as possible. Elenya watched them row back toward the fleet, 12 ships that had crossed an ocean to measure a threat and were retreating. For now, having found it larger than any report could have prepared them for. That went better than I expected, Rin said, jogging down the cliff stairs to join them just as the small boat reached the lead ship. Nobody died. Nobody even lost a limb. By this sanctuary's historical standards, that's practically a diplomatic triumph. It bought us time, Arian said, watching the fleet begin its slow, cautious retreat toward open water. Nothing more. Cray is correct about one thing. There are people in that capital who have built entire lives on the lie Elenya threatens to unravel, and desperate men do not simply accept a losing position. They will return, likely with more than ships. Elenya looked back toward the sanctuary rising behind them, its ancient carved arches catching the morning light, and felt the small brass key warm faintly against her collarbone, as though it, too, understood that the beach they stood on had just become the opening move in something far larger than a single confrontation. Then we don't wait for them to choose the next battlefield, she said, surprising herself with how certain the words sounded. If Lord Cray is right, if there are people in that court who have spent lifetimes protecting this lie, then the lie itself is the weakness. Not the fleet, not the soldiers. The story they've been telling for 200 years. The moment enough people stop believing it, none of their ships or swords will matter at all. That evening, after Rin had retreated to whatever corner of the sanctuary he used for actual sleep, and the last traces of the fleet's sails had vanished below the horizon, Elenya found herself back on the terrace, unable to settle into the quiet of a room that still felt too large and too undeserved to be hers. She wasn't surprised somehow to find Arian still there, wings folded, watching the place where the ships had disappeared as though he expected them to reverse course out of spite. "You should be resting," he said, without turning his head. "Tomorrow will not be gentler than today." "I keep thinking about Lord Cray's face," she said, settling onto the stone beside his foreleg, close enough now that the gesture no longer felt strange to either of them. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a tired man doing an old job badly, because the job itself was rotten before he ever inherited it. "I think that frightens me more than the Inquisitor did. It's easier to fight someone who enjoys the cruelty, harder to fight someone who's just exhausted by it and still won't stop." "Most cruelty wears exhaustion as its favorite disguise," Arian said. "It is easier to continue an old harm than to be the first to admit it was wrong. I have watched 200 years of kings make that same calculation, and every one of them chose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. Is that why you waited so long? Why you didn't just fly to the capital 200 years ago and end it yourself?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought she'd overstepped some boundary neither of them had defined yet. "I considered it," he admitted finally. "More than once in my angrier years, I considered simply burning the lie out of the world by force, and I told myself it was patience that stopped me, or wisdom. The truth is less flattering. I was afraid that if I acted alone, without a keeper beside me, I would only prove every frightened king's oldest story correct. A dragon answering to no one, taking what he wanted by size and flame alone. I did not want to save the truth by becoming the very monster the lie always claimed I was." Elenya looked up at him, at the vast, ancient patience that had apparently cost him 2 centuries of solitude to maintain, and felt something in her chest that she didn't yet have a name for, warm and unfamiliar and entirely undeserved by a world that had spent her whole life trying to convince her she was worth nothing at all. "Well," she said quietly, "you're not alone now." "No," Arian said, and something in his voice had gone softer than she'd heard it yet, softer than a creature his size seemed built to manage. I am not. I find I do not entirely know what to do with that after so long expecting otherwise. Neither do I, she admitted. But I'd rather figure it out with someone than keep erasing names alone in a basement for the rest of my life. For a long moment, neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them felt less like an absence of words, and more like the particular, comfortable quiet of two people who had already said the important part, and didn't need to crowd it with anything further. Arian turned his great head toward her, something in his molten eyes sharpening with an interest that had nothing to do with the retreating fleet. That, he said slowly, is the first thing anyone has said to me in 2 centuries that sounded like the beginning of a plan rather than the end of one. Chapter 7. In the capital, King Dorian Malrose did not react to Lord Cray's report the way his advisor had hoped. He did not rage. He did not panic. He simply listened, seated in the small private council chamber behind the throne room, hands folded, expression unreadable, until Cray finished describing 12 ships retreating from a single dragon and a girl who had, by all accounts, spoken to him with more composure than most seasoned diplomats managed in their first royal audience. "You are telling me," the king said finally, "that the bloodline my great-great-grandfather spent his reign trying to extinguish has not only survived, but found the one remaining dragon capable of undoing 2 centuries of careful policy in a single afternoon. I am telling you the situation requires a different approach than ships and swords," Cray said carefully. "Force did not work on the beach. It will not work at the sanctuary. If your majesty wishes to resolve this without a war, none of us can win against a creature that size. We must find another way to separate the girl from her dragon." It was the Inquisitor, silent until now, who leaned forward with the particular gleam of a man who had already begun solving the problem before it was fully described. "Every creature has an attachment," he said. "Even dragons. Especially dragons, if the old texts are accurate, bound to their keeper not by obligation, but by something closer to devotion. If we cannot pry them apart by force, perhaps we let the girl's own history do the work for us." "Meaning?" the king asked. "Meaning," the Inquisitor said, "there are still people in this kingdom who knew her before the erasure. People whose testimony, whose presence, whose betrayal or loyalty might mean more to her than any dragon's protection. If we can lure her back within reach, using someone she trusts, someone she'd walk toward even against her own better judgment, the dragon becomes irrelevant. You cannot protect what willingly walks back into the cage." Lord Cray's jaw tightened, some flicker of genuine discomfort crossing his weathered face, but he said nothing to object, and the king, watching his silence as closely as his words, understood it as agreement. "Find her weakness," the king said. "Bring her back within these walls quietly before the dragon even knows she's gone. I will not fight a war I cannot win. I will simply make certain the war never needs to happen." Lord Cray lingered after the Inquisitor had gone to arrange the details, alone with the king in a chamber that suddenly felt smaller than it had an hour before. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "may I ask a question you may not wish to answer?" Dorian Malrose waved one tired hand, permission enough. "Do you believe the old records? That the throne's claim to dragon favor was never entirely true? That our line has stood on borrowed legend for 2 centuries? The king was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire rather than his advisor. "I believe," he said finally, "that I inherited a story I did not write, sitting on a foundation I did not lay, and that questioning it too loudly now would collapse considerably more than my own reign. My father believed it. His father believed it. Perhaps none of them believed it at all, and simply understood, as I understand now, that a kingdom needs its myths more than it needs its truths, and a wise king protects the myth regardless of what he privately suspects underneath it. And if the myth can no longer be protected, then," the king said, and for just a moment, something almost like exhaustion cracked through his composure, "I suppose we will discover exactly how much of this kingdom's loyalty was ever built on anything sturdier than a well-told lie. I would rather not find out, Lord Cray. which is why I am asking you to make certain we never have to. Cray bowed and said nothing further, though the doubt he carried out of that chamber would not leave him again for the rest of the story, quietly reshaping every choice he made from that point forward. 400 miles west, Elenya had no idea that her own history was already being weaponized against her. Not until 3 days later, when a small, unremarkable fishing boat approached the black sand beach beneath the sanctuary under a flag of parley, carrying a single passenger who climbed out onto the shore alone, hands raised, and called up toward the cliffs in a voice Elenya recognized instantly, even after everything. "Elenya, please, it's me. It's Dissa. I need to speak with you. Only you." Elenya's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the height of the cliff stairs as she descended them, Rin a careful half-step behind her, Arian circling high overhead with the watchful patience of a creature who had agreed, reluctantly, to let this conversation happen on human terms, at human pace, at least for now. Dissa Fenwick looked smaller than Elenya remembered, older, too, as though the 4 days since the trial had cost her years rather than hours. She stood at the edge of the black sand with her hands still raised, and when Elenya reached the bottom of the stairs, the old woman's composure finally broke, tears cutting through the dust on her weathered face. "I'm sorry," Dissa said, before Elenya could speak at all. "I have thought of nothing else since they took you. I told myself I lied to save my own life, and that was true, and it was also the most cowardly thing I have ever done, and I have not slept a single night since without seeing your face in that corridor." "Why are you here?" "Dissa," Elenya asked, and hated how much her voice still wanted to soften for the woman who'd taught her to read 3 dead languages and fed her honey biscuits for 6 years, even now, even knowing what that softness had already cost her once. "Because they sent me," Dissa said, and the honesty of it landed harder than any lie could have. "Lord Cray's men came to the sanctuary 3 nights ago. They told me if I did not convince you to return to the capital quietly, without the dragon, they would ensure I never worked in an archive again. And worse than that, they made certain I understood what worse than that meant." Her hands were shaking now, visible even from the distance where Elenya had stopped, refusing to close the last few steps between them. "I am not here to trick you, child. I am here because I am a frightened old woman who has already failed you once, and I did not have the courage to refuse them a second time. But I could not do it without telling you the truth first. It is a trap, Elenya. If you come back with me, they are waiting to take you the moment you're within the capital walls, and the dragon will be too far behind to stop it." For a long moment, Elenya said nothing at all, turning the weight of it over in her mind. The cruelty of using the one person whose betrayal had already broken something in her once, sending her back with just enough honesty woven through the trap to make refusing it feel like another kind of cruelty altogether. "They're using your fear against both of us," she said finally, "making you the bait and the warning in the same breath so that whatever I choose I lose something." "Yes," Dissa said miserably. "I am sorrier than I have words for." It was Rin, watching from a few steps up the stairway, who spoke into the silence that followed, his usual easy humor entirely absent. "There's a version of this where we use their own trap against them," he said slowly. "If they're expecting Elenya to walk back into the capital quietly, without the dragon, what happens if she walks back in loudly, with the dragon flying directly overhead where every noble, every guard, every commoner in that city can see exactly who's protecting her? High above, circling on a thermal current with the patient attention of a creature who had heard every word despite the distance, Arian banked lower, close enough now that his shadow fell across the beach, like an answer, arriving before the question had finished being asked. "They built a trap," Arian said, his voice carrying easily down to the sand, "assuming I would remain a rumor until the moment it closed. Let us instead make certain I am the first thing every soul in that capital sees, long before their trap ever has the chance to spring." Dissa flinched at the sound of his voice, some old, deep-rooted terror finally catching up with her now that the dragon she'd only heard about in frightened whispers was speaking directly over her head. They have soldiers stationed at every gate, she said. Archers on the walls. If you fly in openly, they will not hesitate to. They will hesitate, Arian said, the moment they understand that every arrow loosed at me lands in full view of every citizen in that city. And every citizen in that city has spent 200 years being told dragons only answer to kings. Today, they will learn otherwise, whether their king intends to let them or not. Elenya looked from Dissa's tear-streaked, frightened face to the vast shadow circling above the beach, and felt the shape of a plan finally solidify into something she was no longer afraid to say out loud. Then we don't sneak back into Eldoris, she said. We arrive, publicly, undeniably, and we let the entire capital watch the moment 200 years of careful lying runs directly into the truth it was always built to outrun. Dissa's hands finally stopped shaking, some fragile, disbelieving hope breaking through the fear on her face for the first time since she'd stepped off the boat. Child, she whispered, do you have any idea what you're about to walk into? Yes, Elenya said, and for the first time since the trial, the word came out entirely without fear. I'm about to walk into the same city that erased my name. And this time, I'm bringing someone with me that no ledger, no blade, and no king has ever managed to erase in 200 years of trying. They spent the rest of that afternoon on the terrace, mapping out a plan with the particular, careful energy of people who understood that a single mistake would hand Lord Cray exactly the quiet, tidy capture he'd been sent to arrange. Rin produced a set of old capital maps from the sanctuary's archives, marking gate positions and garrison houses with the ease of a man who had apparently spent more idle hours than he'd ever admitted studying a kingdom he claimed to have no particular loyalty to. The western gate is ceremonial, he explained, tracing a route with one finger. Wide, mostly unguarded except on festival days, because nobody in their right mind expects a threat to arrive announcing itself. If Arian comes in low over the eastern hills at dawn, before the garrison's even finished its morning drills, half the capital will be awake and watching before a single soldier reaches a horn to sound the alarm. And once we're inside, Elenya asked. Once you're inside, Dissa said quietly, some of her old, familiar steadiness returning now that fear had given way to purpose. You go straight to the Hall of Records, not the throne room, the hall. If the king wants this quiet, he cannot afford to have you dragged away in front of witnesses, and the hall is the one place in that entire capital where every clerk, every scribe, every apprentice like the ones I've trained for 40 years, will recognize exactly what's been done to your ledgers the moment you show them where to look. You'd testify, Elenya said, in front of the king himself. I already failed to testify once, Dissa said, and it has cost me every night's sleep since. I do not intend to fail a second time, child, whatever it costs me this time. Arian, still circling lazily above the terrace, banked lower until his shadow crossed the map spread between them. Then we are agreed, he said. We do not sneak, we do not hide. We arrive exactly as loudly as 200 years of careful silence deserves, and we let the truth do what blades and decrees never could. Elenya looked around at the small, unlikely gathering that had assembled around her in less than a week. An old archivist finally choosing courage over safety, a keeper of a forgotten sanctuary who'd apparently been waiting his whole life for a reason to matter, and a dragon who had crossed an ocean and outlasted 2 centuries of kings for the chance to say her name out loud in the one place that had tried hardest to forget it. Tomorrow then, she said. At dawn. Nobody argued. Nobody that night slept particularly well either, but for the first time since the trial had stripped her of a name, a home, and a history, Elenya Ashmere fell asleep with something that felt unmistakably like hope, and woke before dawn already reaching for it. Chapter 8. Eldoris woke that morning to a sound it had never learned a name for. It began as a low vibration in the stone of the eastern hills, felt before it was heard, rattling shutters and dishes and the nerves of every early baker already awake to start the day's ovens. By the time the sound resolved into the unmistakable rhythm of enormous wings, half the capital was already in the streets. Faces turned east, watching a shape too large to be a bird and too deliberate to be a storm cut across the brightening sky with a girl on its back, and its shadow falling over rooftops that had spent 200 years believing dragons were a story their grandparents told to explain old ruins. Elenya felt the city's collective gasp almost as clearly as she felt the wind against her face. Thousands of upturned faces, market stalls abandoned mid-setup, a guard captain on the eastern wall dropping his morning report entirely to stare, slack-jawed, at the exact creature every training manual he'd ever studied insisted was extinct or exiled beyond recall. "Steady," Arian said, feeling her grip tighten against his neck. "They are not looking at a monster. They are looking at a memory they didn't know they still had. Let them look." He did not land in the western gate as planned, not immediately. Instead, he circled the capital once, low and slow and utterly unhurried, giving every soul in Eldoris the full, undeniable sight of him. Wings blotting out the morning sun in long, sweeping passes, deliberately unthreatening in a way that somehow made him more unsettling than any dive or roar could have managed, because it was the composure of a creature who had absolutely nothing left to prove, and all the time in the world to prove it anyway. By the time he finally descended toward the Hall of Records courtyard, the streets below had gone eerily quiet, not the terrified silence of a city bracing for an attack, but something closer to held breath, the particular hush of a crowd that suspected, somewhere beneath 2 centuries of careful teaching, that it was about to witness something its own history books had lied to it about. Rin and Dissa were waiting near the hall's side entrance exactly where the plan had placed them, having entered separately through the ordinary gates hours before dawn to avoid drawing early attention. Dissa's face, when Elenya climbed down from Arian's foreleg into the courtyard, had none of its usual careful composure, only a fierce, frightened determination that Elenya recognized, with some surprise, as the exact expression she'd worn herself on the Western Road 4 days ago. They made it as far as the hall's central archive chamber before the soldiers arrived, a full garrison unit, moving with the disciplined haste of men who had clearly rehearsed this exact scenario, led by the same Crown Inquisitor, whose crimson robes Elenya had last seen retreating from a beach he'd badly misjudged. "You were told never to return," the Inquisitor said, though his voice carried none of the confident authority it had held at her trial. Something about facing her again, in daylight, with a dragon visible through the chamber's high windows, had clearly cost him some essential piece of his certainty. "I was told a lot of things," Elenya said, "by people who erased the truth first and invented the crime to justify it afterward. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to show every clerk and scribe in this hall exactly what your office has spent 200 years hiding. This hall belongs to the Crown." "This hall," Dissa said, stepping forward with a steadiness that surprised even her, "belongs to the truth, Inquisitor, whatever the Crown has paid us all these years to pretend otherwise. I have spent 40 years cataloging this kingdom's history. I know precisely where the erasures lie, and precisely how deliberate they were, because I helped bury the evidence of my own cowardice twice this week alone. I will not help bury it a 3rd time." She moved to the central cabinet, the same locked archive Elenya had opened with her small brass key 5 days earlier, and this time produced a master key of her own, one she'd apparently carried, unused, for longer than Elenya wanted to guess at. Inside, stacked exactly where Elenya remembered them, sat the ledgers bearing 2 centuries of careful, deliberate scrapes where House Ashmere's name should have stood. "Look," Dissa said, turning to address not the Inquisitor but the growing crowd of clerks and apprentices who had begun gathering at the chamber's edges, drawn by the commotion and the impossible sight of a dragon's shadow crossing the high windows. Every one of these entries, erased at the exact same spot, in the exact same manner across 200 years. Not accidents, not coincidences. A policy maintained by every Inquisitor's office since the reign of the first Malrose king, to erase a bloodline this kingdom feared more than it ever feared an actual enemy. A murmur moved through the gathered clerks, and Elenya watched something shift in the room. Not rebellion, not yet, but the particular unsettled energy of people who had spent their careers trusting the integrity of the records they maintained, now confronted with proof that the highest office above them had been quietly corrupting that integrity for longer than anyone present had been alive. "Seize them," the Inquisitor snapped, some of his composure finally cracking entirely, "before this becomes a spectacle the crown cannot control." The soldiers hesitated, not from cowardice, Elenya realized, but from the same unsettled uncertainty spreading through the clerks, the particular paralysis of men ordered to enforce a lie in front of witnesses who had just watched that lie exposed. It was that hesitation, brief as it was, that gave Lord Cray time to arrive. He entered through the main archive doors with the king himself half a step behind him. Dorian Malrose, crowned and robed for a public appearance he had clearly not planned to make. His face carrying an expression Elenya couldn't immediately read, somewhere between fury and something that looked, disconcertingly, like exhaustion. The chamber went utterly silent. "Your Majesty," the Inquisitor began, "the fugitive has—" "Enough," the king said, and something in the single word carried more weight than the Inquisitor's entire tirade had managed. He looked at Elenya for a long moment, then at the open cabinet of ledgers behind her, then, finally, through the high windows, at the vast dark shape of Aryan Velkar waiting in the courtyard beyond, wings folded, watching the hall with the patient, immovable stillness of a creature who had outlasted every king who'd ever tried to erase what stood in front of him now. "You have caused," the king said slowly, turning back to Elenya, "considerable difficulty for a kingdom that believed this problem settled 200 years before either of us was born." "I didn't cause the difficulty," Elenya said, holding his gaze despite every instinct urging her to look away. "I only refused to let it stay buried. The difficulty was always here, Your Majesty. It's simply the first time anyone has made you look directly at it." For a long, taut moment, nothing in the chamber moved, not the soldiers, not the clerks, not even the Inquisitor, whose crimson robe suddenly looked less like a symbol of authority, and more like the last, thin costume of a lie about to run out of road entirely. Then, from the courtyard beyond the high windows, Arian's voice rolled through the Hall of Records with a weight that made every stone in the ancient building seem to hold its breath. 200 years, Dorian Malrose," the Dragon King said. "Your line has told this kingdom that dragons chose your throne. I have come to correct that record, in front of every witness this hall can hold. And I did not come alone." Through the high windows, faint at first and then unmistakable, a second shadow crossed the morning sky. Then a third. Then more than anyone in the chamber could immediately count, wings upon wings darkening the sky above the capital of Eldoris in numbers no living soul in the kingdom had ever seen or been told to expect. The king's face, for the first time in the entire encounter, went entirely pale. "That's not possible," Lord Cray whispered, staring up through the windows at a sky that no longer looked like the ordinary morning it had been an hour before. "There is only one dragon left. There has been only one dragon left for 2 centuries. Every record confirms it." "Every record," Elenya said quietly, watching the same sky with a wonder she didn't try to hide, "was written by the people who needed you to believe that. It seems the truth kept better company than your ledgers ever admitted." Outside, in the courtyard, Rin had abandoned all pretense of composure, laughing under his breath in open disbelief as he stared up at the darkening sky. "He never told me," he muttered, mostly to himself. 200 years living in that sanctuary, and he never once told me there were others. There were others, as it turned out, though even Elenya would not learn the full truth of it until much later that night, when the chaos of the day had finally quieted enough for Arian to explain. Not every dragon had died in the long centuries of human erasure, only gone still, folded into deep, deliberate dormancy in the coldest, least hospitable corners of the world, waiting the way seeds wait beneath frozen ground, because a dragon without a keeper to answer had little reason left to remain awake among a species determined to hunt or forget it. The resonance that had flickered faintly for 200 years had never reached far enough to rouse them. But the surge Elenya had unknowingly triggered on the sanctuary terrace 3 days ago, the moment her blood had finally answered Arian's call clearly enough to shake dust from his own ancient bones, had carried further than either of them understood at the time. It had crossed mountains and frozen seas and the long, silent centuries of every dragon still sleeping beneath them. And one by one, they had opened eyes that had not opened in generations, and turned, as Arian once had, toward the one signal in the world worth waking for. None of that explanation mattered yet, not in the chamber, not with the king's face still draining of color, and the inquisitor's crimson robes looking thinner by the second. What mattered in that suspended, breathless moment was the sight through the high windows, dragon after dragon descending over the rooftops of a capital that had spent 2 centuries insisting they were extinct, landing in courtyards and squares, and along the ancient palace walls with a care that suggested none of them had come to burn anything, only to witness. The clerks who had gathered at the edges of the chamber were no longer murmuring. Some had sunk to their knees without seeming to notice they'd done it. One young apprentice, barely older than Elenya had been when she first opened that fatal ledger, was openly weeping, staring up through the window as though the sky itself had finally forgiven the kingdom for something none of them had known to apologize for. "Your Majesty," Lord Cray said quietly, and for the first time since Elenya had met him, his careful, unreadable composure had entirely abandoned him. "I do not believe there is a version of today that ends with this remaining a secret." King Dorian Malrose said nothing for a long moment, watching the sky fill with the exact creatures his family's entire claim to legitimacy had been built on lying about. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the authority it had carried into the chamber. "No," he agreed quietly, "I do not believe there is." Chapter 9. They moved the confrontation to the palace's grand courtyard, because there was no longer any pretense of keeping it contained, and because Arian had made it plain, in the particular quiet way that carried more authority than any shout, that whatever happened next would happen where the entire capital could see it. By mid-morning, the courtyard and every street leading toward it had filled with more people than Elenya had ever seen gathered in one place. Nobles in half-fastened formal robes, guild clerks still wearing their mourning aprons, soldiers who had abandoned their posts not from cowardice, but from the same overwhelming need to witness that had emptied every shop and kitchen in the capital. Dragons lined the palace walls and the surrounding rooftops in numbers that made the ancient stone look small by comparison, patient, watchful, utterly unbothered by the thousands of upturned human faces studying them in return. King Dorian Malrose stood at the top of the palace steps, flanked by Lord Cray on one side and a suddenly much diminished inquisitor on the other. And for the first time since Elenya had met him, he looked less like a king and more like a man who understood, with total clarity, that the next few minutes would determine which version of himself history remembered. "You have a claim," he said, addressing Elenya directly now, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard with the particular effort of a man forcing steadiness into words he had never expected to need. "A claim my ancestors spent 2 centuries working to erase. I will not insult either of us by pretending the ledgers Dissaf Fenwick produced this morning are anything other than exactly what they appear to be." He paused, and something almost like relief crossed his tired face, the specific unburdening of a man finally setting down a lie he had never chosen to inherit. "What is it you want, Elenya Ashmere? A crown? My throne stands on foundations you could dismantle with a single word from that creature beside you, and we both know it." The courtyard held its breath. Elenya felt the weight of thousands of eyes, felt the warmth of the brass key against her collarbone, felt Arian's presence beside her steady as bedrock, and understood with a clarity that surprised her exactly what her answer needed to be. "I don't want your throne," she said, and her voice carried further than she expected, helped, she suspected, by a courtyard gone utterly silent to hear it. "I spent 22 years being told I was nobody, Because a policy built on fear decided my name was too dangerous to exist. I don't want to become the next person deciding whose name gets to survive and whose gets erased. I've seen exactly where that road ends, Your Majesty. I watched it end on my own birth ledger. Then what, the king asked, would satisfy you? The truth, Elenya said. Not buried in a locked cabinet with one key nobody's supposed to use. Not filed away for the next frightened advisor to decide, is too dangerous for the public to know. I want an order, independent of your throne, independent of the Inquisitor's office, independent of anyone with a reason to erase an inconvenient name ever again, whose only purpose is to protect the historical record. Keepers, archivists, dragons who choose to stand witness. A guarantee that no family, no bloodline, no forgotten clerk's daughter ever again spends her whole life being erased one careful scrape at a time because the truth was inconvenient to someone sitting on a throne. A long silence followed, broken only by the low, rhythmic breathing of dozens of dragons along the courtyard walls, patient as mountains, waiting to see what their king. For many of them were already beginning, in some old and wordless way, to think of Arian that way again, after 2 centuries of exile, would choose to do with the moment in front of him. It was Arian who finally moved, stepping forward with a deliberate, ceremonial slowness that drew every eye in the courtyard toward him. He lowered his great head, and then, in a gesture no living soul present had ever seen a dragon make toward anyone, knelt, folding his enormous frame down until his crowned head came level with Elenya's shoulder, wings settling against the ancient stone with a sound like the closing of some vast and ancient book. For 200 years, Arian said, and his voice, though quiet now, carried to the very edges of the crowded courtyard. This kingdom told itself that dragons bowed to thrones. I kneel now, in front of every witness this city can hold, to correct that record permanently. I do not kneel to a crown. I kneel to Elenya Ashmere, last living keeper of a bloodline this kingdom tried, again and again, to erase, and failed. He lifted his head slightly, molten eyes finding hers with a warmth that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with 2 centuries of waiting finally, quietly, ending. You were never erased, he said, softer now, meant for her though the whole courtyard heard it. They only ever lacked the power to preserve your name. That failure was always theirs, Elenya Ashmere, never yours. Something broke open in Elenya's chest at those words, not the grief that had lived there since the trial, but something gentler underneath it, the particular release of a wound finally being witnessed instead of hidden. She reached out and rested her palm against the ridge of scale along his lowered head, and felt, beneath thousands of watching eyes, the resonance settle between them like a held note finally allowed to resolve. Around the courtyard, one by one, the other dragons lowered their heads in the same gesture, not commanded, not trained, simply following the old, wordless understanding that had bound keepers and dragons together for longer than any human throne had existed. And slowly, hesitantly, the crowd of clerks and guild workers and off-duty soldiers began to kneel too, not from fear. Elenya understood, watching it spread through the courtyard like a tide finally allowed to come in, but from the particular, overwhelming relief of watching a 200-year lie finally collapse under the simple weight of an undeniable truth. King Dorian Malrose was the last to kneel, and when he did, it was not the practiced motion of a man performing submission for a crowd, but the slower, heavier movement of someone finally setting down a burden he had carried without ever choosing to. The crown, he said, will not oppose the order you've described. I would ask only this in return, that whatever new order rises from today, it remembers that not every person who upheld the old lie chose it freely. Some of us only inherited it and spent our whole lives too afraid to be the one who finally set it down. Elenya looked at him for a long moment, thinking of Dissaz's tear-streaked face on the black sand beach, of Tomas adjusting his satchel strap and walking the other way, of Lord Cray's tired, complicated guilt, an entire kingdom of people who had built their lives, in ways large and small, on a foundation none of them had chosen, but all of them had maintained. The order I'm building isn't for punishment, she said. It's for memory. There's a difference, and I intend to make sure everyone who serves it understands it as clearly as I do. Tomas Pharaoh found her 3 days later, waiting outside the sanctuary's newly reopened gates with the particular nervous posture of a man who had rehearsed an apology so many times it no longer sounded natural in his own head. Elenya almost didn't recognize him at first, not because his face had changed, but because the easy confidence she remembered from childhood had been replaced by something smaller, more uncertain. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said before she could speak. "I saw you that day. I saw the soldiers and I saw your face, and I chose my guild apprenticeship over 40 steps toward you, and I have thought about that choice every single day since. I'm not here for forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I know exactly what I did." Elenya studied him for a long moment, feeling the old hurt sit alongside something newer and steadier that hadn't existed in her chest a week ago. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt," she said finally. "But I understand fear better now than I did 4 days ago. I watched an entire kingdom kneel to a truth it spent 200 years being too afraid to admit. I'm not going to hold one frightened boy's 40 steps against him forever, Tomas. Just don't walk the other way next time. That's all I'll ever ask." He nodded, something loosening in his shoulders, and Elenya found to her own quiet surprise that letting go of that particular grief cost her far less than she'd feared it would. That evening, once the sanctuary had settled into the unfamiliar quiet of a place no longer waiting for anything, Elenya found Arian on the terrace again, watching the sea the way he always did when his thoughts had wandered somewhere he wasn't ready to share. "You knelt in front of an entire kingdom," she said, settling beside him. 200 years of pride, and you knelt without a moment's hesitation." "Pride was never what kept me on those cliffs," Arian said. "Grief was. Pride I would have surrendered in an afternoon, the first month I felt your resonance. Grief takes longer to set down, even after the reason for it has finally been resolved." "Is it resolved?" He was quiet for a long moment, molten eyes reflecting the last color draining from the horizon. "Some of it," he admitted. 2 centuries of solitude do not undo themselves in a week, however remarkable the week. But I find, sitting here beside you, that I am no longer counting the days the way I once did. I have stopped waiting, Elenya Ashmere. I find I would rather simply be here, for however long here turns out to last." Something in his voice, quieter and more uncertain than she'd ever heard the ancient dragon king allow himself to sound, told her the sentence had cost him more honesty than any speech he'd given in that courtyard. "Good," she said softly, leaning her shoulder against the warm ridge of his foreleg, watching the same darkening horizon he was watching, "because I'm not planning on going anywhere either." In the weeks that followed, the archive of unerased truths was founded in the very sanctuary that had sheltered Elenya through the worst days of her life. An order of keepers, archivists and dragons standing joint witness over the historical record, answerable to no throne, protected by wings that no army had ever successfully challenged. Desaf Fenwick became its first chief archivist, finally given the authority to protect the truths she'd spent 40 years quietly cataloging in fear. Rin, to absolutely no one's surprise, appointed himself its permanent and self-declared irreplaceable caretaker, on the grounds that someone needed to keep everyone else from sleeping through the important parts. And Elenya Ashmere, the girl who had once erased other people's names for a living, who had been told by royal decree that she had never existed at all, stood in the gallery of painted faces that shared her jaw and her eyes, no longer alone among them, and understood, at last, exactly what it felt like to be remembered. She commissioned one final addition to that ancient wall before the season turned, not of herself, though the artists had begged to paint her likeness a dozen times over, but of the gallery itself, empty, waiting, with a single unfinished space left deliberately blank beneath her own portrait. When she was asked why, she only smiled and said that history was not finished being written, and that somewhere, In some century she would never see, another name deserved room to be remembered too. And this time, no one would ever have to fight 200 years to prove it had always belonged there. Years later, children in the archive of unerased truths study history from ledgers no blade will ever touch again. The first chapter, every apprentice learns to read, opens with a single line, carved above the gallery doors themselves. This is the story of the woman history erased, and the sky returned to correct the record. Elenya still walks that gallery some evenings, tracing the faces of keepers who came before her, and the dragons who wait patiently along the terrace understand, without needing to be told, that some griefs take longer to set down than others, and that healing was never about forgetting what was taken, only refusing to let it stay buried. My love, if you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you for staying with Elenya through every erased page and every quiet betrayal it took to get her here. Stories like this remind me that being forgotten by the wrong people is never the same as being unworthy of remembering, and that sometimes the truth just needs someone patient enough to wait for it. If this story found you tonight, tell me where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one. With love, Nora.